and our ethnic identities will be preserved in eternity. Revelation 14:6. Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. This passage explains that the eternal gospel is for every nation of peoples and tribe. And always remember, Almighty God created each nation of peoples and tribes, so ignore anyone who claims that your peoples weren't divinely created. Revelation 21:14. And the nations of them which are saved shall walk in the light of it. Next we will read the table of nations from the Bible. Anyone who denies these nations, that person also denies the Holy Bible. But let's start with the actual definition of a nation. What is a nation? A nation is a distinct peoples. The English word nation originates from Middle English circa 1300, where it appeared as nation, meaning a race of people, large group of people with common ancestry and language. This term was derived from Old French nation, which itself came from Latin nationem, the accusative form of natio, meaning birth, origin, breed, stock, kind, species, race of people, tribe. The Latin word natio literally meant that which has been born, stemming from natus, the past participle of nashi, meaning be born. The root of this word traces back to the Proto-Indo-European root gene, which refers to give birth, beget, and is associated with procreation and familial and tribal groups. In Middle English, the term was used to describe a collective of people sharing common ancestry, language, and cultural traits. Every single one of these definitions offer an adequate understanding as a first step to maintaining the bounds of God's peoples or nations. Genesis 10. The Holy Bible's table of nations. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. From these the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. The sons of Ham: Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush: Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. The sons of Rama: Sheba and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Egypt fathered Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim, Pathrusim, Casluhim, from whom the Philistines came, and Caphtorim. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, the Sinites, the Arvadites, the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Afterward the clans of the Canaanites dispersed, and the territory of the Canaanites extended from Sidon in the direction of Gerar as far as Gaza, and in the direction of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. To Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the elder brother of Japheth, children were born. The sons of Shem: Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram: Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Arpachshad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Eber. To Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan fathered Almodad, Sheleph, Hazarmaveth, Jerah, Hadoram, Uzal, Dikla, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. The territory in which they lived extended from Mesha in the direction of Sephar to the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. These are the clans of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. I will attempt to simplify this topic based on old maps that can be found in old Bibles that explained who populated the earth and where. These maps and these lessons became less common after World War II and the civil rights movement in America out of fear that they may be labeled as a Nazi. Our pastors wouldn't dare touch these biblical topics, and Christian schools won't allow their students to discuss these topics because the world made these biblical topics taboo and dangerous to discuss. There are Americans who feel justified with using violence at the mere mention of race. That's not justice, that's not Christian, that is evil. Anyone can observe that God who created us placed us in different divinely created peoples, and those differences suggest that God has different purposes for our peoples, and that plan is separate from other peoples. Attempts to cross those God-created bounds now become a form of the Tower of Babel. Descendants of Japheth are white. Descendants of Ham are black. Descendants of Shem are yellow, brown, or red. This is backed up with the view of some European scholars like John Webb, who've made the case that the Native American peoples of North and South America, which would include Latinos, also Iranic peoples of Eastern Persia, and also the Indias, descended from Shem, possibly through his descendant Joktan. Genesis 10:30 states that Joktan's descendants migrated eastward, so they would have reached the Americas through Alaska or by traveling over the Pacific Ocean. What I share with you next is my own personal understanding after pondering about the Table of Nations for quite some time. Clearly, Japheth fathered Europeans and Ham fathered Africans. It's Shem who offers the most ancient interest to me. How did all those descendants of Shem reach so many different continents and so many far-reaching islands? Clearly, Shem populated the Middle East and Asia, but Shem also populated North America, South America, and many different islands. This son of Noah fathered what we call the indigenous peoples from many different locations. They migrated to these locations first. Well, I believe that's our first clue. Shem was Noah's son. You can bet your bottom dollar Noah's descendants were clearly capable seafarers because knowledge is passed down from father to son. And clearly this line of Noah's descent, Shem's posterity, pushed deliberately across vast seas in search of new lands. The primary evidence of these migrations is the consistent early presence of similar peoples on distant islands and continents. Shared physical and cultural traits between groups such as Hawaiians, Maori, Latinos, Indian Americans, Middle Easterners, Asians, etc., point to a common ancestral source best explained by a clearly orchestrated Shemitic maritime expansion all across the globe. The commonality is clearly best explained in this manner. Their commonality can truly only be logically explained in this fashion, in my opinion. With the spread of natives, or descendants of Shem, it is logical that these voyages were punishment, something natives weren't proud of. But it is highly possible that a leader or multiple leaders sent out criminals in a plethora of boats as punishment, which led to the spread of Shem's natives, which would also explain the uncivilized state with many of the natives, whereas Shem's descendants who remained in Asia showed advanced intelligence, which would line up with this theory that possibly some intelligent leaders sent their worst criminals out to sea, or possibly volunteers were of less intelligence than those who concocted the idea, because usually risk-takers are those of lower intelligence, which would also explain the uncivilized condition that descendants of Japheth later found descendants of Shem in as natives or indigenous peoples. To me, this is a plausible explanation for hyper-intelligent Asian countries versus the underdeveloped natives. To explain my theory further, I believe it's extremely plausible that the dispersal of Shem's descendants, who we now call natives or indigenous peoples, could have resulted from organized maritime exiles, where some leaders sent criminals away by sea as punishment. This could explain why many of these dispersed natives or indigenous people were less advanced compared to those who remained in Asia, who developed sophisticated civilizations. My theory is that those cast out were either the worst offenders or volunteer thrill seekers of lower intellect, because high-risk ventures like traveling into an open sea with no clue where you're landing, this clearly would often attract individuals with lesser cognitive capacity. Thus, when descendants of Japheth later encountered these descendants of Shem, they found them in a primitive state due to their origins as exiled outcasts or daredevils of lower intelligence. There very well could have been leaders who were only keeping their best while sending their worst away to sea with a maritime exile. The uncivilized state of natives suggests that some form of penal transportation took place with Shem's posterity. This next passage really fits what happened in America and throughout many areas that descendants of Shem claimed as natives. Genesis 9:27. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth. Genesis 9:27 prophesied that God would enlarge Japheth, and he would dwell in the tents of Shem, with Canaan as his servant. This was fulfilled as Japheth's descendants, Europeans and later Americans, expanded globally, settling in and governing lands first occupied by Shem's descendants, including the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The United States, as a dominant Japhethite nation, rose to global influence, embodying this prophecy by inhabiting and shaping the territories of Shem's line. This pattern repeats throughout many locations worldwide, including many locations where the British Empire, the French, the Germans, the Dutch, and more settled in several indigenous territories across the globe. The descendants of Shem reached the Americas through multiple routes. The Alaskan migration, evidenced by Eskimos and other indigenous groups, confirms overland movement via the Bering Land Bridge, as widely documented in academic sources. At the same time, the presence of Shem's descendants in Hawaii proves they also crossed the Pacific by sea. Their arrival in Hawaii was part of an eastward expansion, meaning some groups landed there while others reached the Americas directly by oceanic voyages. This dual pathway, Alaskan and seafaring, demonstrates both the range and capability of Shem's descendants as skilled navigators and true heirs of Noah who built the ark which withstood the great flood. I close this topic with this. Both transsexual ideology and multiculturalism are an attempt to erase or ignore God's creation of male and female and separation of races. Multiculturalism is an attempt to erase God's bounds of the people. God intended for land masses and water to separate races. When living in the same country, we'd be wise to still adhere to God's intended bounds. Our differences as people are obvious. God made us different, and He made it obvious who He intended for us to have as our community and who He did not. Your God-given community looks like you, shares the same heritage as you, and the mere fact that your Creator placed you in your God-given community is extremely special. Your community are the peoples that God picked for you. And don't let anyone pry you away from your God-given community. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Romans 10:9-10. That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised Him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation.